Welcome to Safer Journeys, a podcast dedicated to raising children, ending violence, and ending oppression. I'm Heather, preventionist here in Streator, Illinois.
And I'm Melissa, the Director of Community Engagement with Prevention Programming. And we are from Safer Journeys, a domestic and sexual violence agency serving Livingston and LaSalle counties in the state of Illinois. I want to give a trigger warning right off the bat. We have been in a little trauma mini-series, and so if this is not your cup of tea, or if today this is not media you wish to consume, feel free to stop the podcast right now. We still love you. Please take care of yourselves. We are going to be talking about protective factors and resilience today.
And guess what? We have a surprise for you. Stephannie's back.
I came back. Yes. We didn't expect it, so it's such a happy surprise.
Yeah, we said last episode, this is it for Stephannie, but we just couldn't get rid of her. We love her too much.
Thanks for having me back. I'm super excited. I made the comment about not getting to talk about resiliency, and they were like, fine, you can. So thanks.
The guilt trip there.
It was barely a guilt trip. We're like, okay, let's do it.
I know. Like, let's all rearrange our schedules. Yes. Oh, well, we're so happy to have you here. And we are going to be talking about these protective factors, resilience, and resistance when facing trauma. And protective factors are those things in a person's life that help reduce the impact of trauma.
Yeah, Steph, do you want to say what you said last time, if you remember? Because it was really nice. You said it was like the positive.
Oh,
the
yes.
hope.
So I feel like when we're talking about trauma and we're talking about all of these things that are so emotional, so heavy, that protective factors and resiliency are like the hope at the end there. They're the thing that says, like, this is heavy, this is hard, but there is something we can do about it. There are things that we can build and put into place to overcome that trauma.
Yeah, which is, I'm very grateful that we have this and that this sort of research has been done, and that, you know, the community of social work and psychology have invested so heavily in what we like to call as strengths-based prevention. So we are going to talk about some of these protective factors. These are not all of the protective factors. So there are a lot of opportunities for resiliency, for resistance, and developing protective factors. These are just going to be some of them. And we're going to break them down into the same way we broke down ACEs. We're going to talk about family, we're going to talk about community, and we're going to talk about the individual. So I'm going to start with a few things from like what we call our family or caregiver area or realm of protective factors. So we know for sure that young people who grow up in homes that engage in healthy conflict do tend to have a better resistance or resiliency with trauma. And Stephannie, do you have anything you'd like to add to, like, what does healthy conflict look like?
When I think of healthy conflict, I think about like my main thing with healthy conflict is being able to repair afterwards. Like that's the end of the conflict, but I think that's such a huge piece of it. But healthy conflict looks like being able to say like, hey, we don't agree about this. I don't think about it the same way as you do. And we're going to talk it out. And I'm going to still love you later. And if I did something that wasn't loving towards you, I'm going to own it and I'm going to apologize for it. And we're going to figure out how do we move forward from this.
So like accountability.
Absolutely accountability, especially from a parent perspective. I think that so often adults can get it in their head that like, I'm the grown-up, so I'm right. And if I could tell you the amount of times my children prove to me that just because I'm the grown-up, I am not right, it's so many because they're so smart and they think about the world in such a different way than I do that sometimes they come to me with something and they say, hey, Mom, but what about this thing? And I'm like, wow, you're so smart and you're so right. Yeah, let's do it your way. So just being able to also remove the ego from that and being able to listen and come together as part of the same team, because a family is a team and you're all in it together. So being able to see your spouse, your partner, your kids as part of that team and working together with them to solve the challenges that life is going to throw your way.
Yeah, your end goal is all the same, right? We want everyone to be happy and healthy and well-adjusted.
Yes.
Yeah. That's great. I love the team. The team
I do
analogy.
too.
That's great.
Yeah.
I think I'd add too, healthy conflict isn't going to be purposefully hurtful, whether it's using words or physical violence. We are not trying to cause harm or punish the other person, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And if you notice that you are starting to do that, it might be because there's a behavior coming up in your child that's triggering you. And I know this is something that started coming up for me last summer where I was like, oh my gosh, it's because I'm seeing myself reflected in the world and I need to go work on that myself. So, and it is getting a lot better. Like I have an awareness now and I'm like, oh, there it is popping up again. Okay, make sure you take a few extra breaths because like...
You're doing your mindfulness right there, right? That's your mindfulness, your breathing and being aware of what's triggering you.
Right.
And we talked so much about what the role of a parent is in a family and that so much of it falls on you to do your own healing work and to know your own triggers. Like I know that there are certain things that my kids do that are going to trigger me and I either don't put myself in those situations or I recognize them and I walk away and I tap in a different parent and I say, this one's yours. Have fun. Because I know my triggers and I know myself and I know that I want to show up for them as the best version of me. And so until I can work through those triggers and figure them out, sometimes showing up as the best version of me is tapping someone else in.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, I absolutely love that. That's great. I know I've learned some of my triggers because of parenting. Like I would never have known that was a trigger for me if it hadn't happened.
Right.
Let's see. What else do we have for family and protective factors? Oh, this one's a nice one. I like this one. Having meaningful engagement with their caregivers and family and the nurturing of the child. Obviously, I mean, we know that that's what the main goal is, but sometimes, things derail us. Sometimes we got to get back on track.
Yes.
And this third one, I personally struggle with the boundaries and the lines on this one because my stepson's going to be 18 in a month or so. So this one is monitoring and supervising the child. And that doesn't just include like when they're playing or what they're watching, but like my teenager is in his room on the computer for hours on end, right? And what about he has his own cell phone, so there are a lot of different things that we're still navigating as a family as he's gotten older, like where the boundaries are. But it is definitely important, no matter what age your child is, that there's some supervision and there is some monitoring going on there.
Yes. And my 6-year-old just a few days ago got her first account on Roblox.
Ooh.
And so my spouse he got his own account as well at the same time. And then they've been playing together. We've reached out to one of her friends who we know is on Roblox. And so far she has 2 friends, her papa and her friend. Mm-hmm. And then they're talking to me about getting an account too. And so, I mean, and the way that we have found it helpful to do with our daughter is to be playful with her when it comes to the supervision. Otherwise, she's like, what are you doing? She's so smart. And she's just like, why is that important to you? What's that about? Mm-hmm. The other day, and I know this doesn't really have to do with much with monitoring and supervision, but I nicked my skin shaving, okay? Mm-hmm. And so she's like, why are you bleeding so much? And I was like, oh man, well, there's something that older women do, and sometimes they shave their legs. And not everybody does, but I did. And I'm bleeding now. And she goes, oh my gosh, I have to go get you a Band-Aid. And she helped. She's like, I'm going to put it on for you. Mm-hmm. And she's just like, why would you want to shave your legs? Like, she's like questioning me.
She's nurturing you, right?
She is.
Yeah.
She is. She has really good why questions. And this is a 6-year-old. And I know you all know and value 6-year-olds, but I just want to keep reiterating, like, they are so smart and wise already. And it is just so interesting when they start like really asking those why questions. They're like, why is it this way? Like, why would you ever do that to yourself if you're going to bleed? Like,
now you're reevaluating everything you've ever done. Whoa.
I think that illustrates too just how important those family protective factors are, because the fact that she could have that conversation with you, the fact that she knows to ask why questions, the fact that she felt nurturing towards you, all of those things are protective factors that she's learned from you. And so it's actually a really amazing story and highlights so much of what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Stephannie,
modeling is the best teacher, I'm telling you.
Oh, it is. And every time I'm with Stephannie, I always feel like she just gives me this big warm hug of like, you're a good mother. I promise you.
It's because you are.
Well, listen, I think a lot of parents, and maybe mothers in particularly, I can't say for sure, but like they feel like they're not living up to the standards that society has placed on them, right?
Yeah.
But,
or even placed on themselves. Like, my expectations of myself are so utterly high, and a lot of times I do not live up to them. And then I talk with other people, they're like, that is a completely normal thing. Like, I think you have very high expectations of yourself. I'm like, oh yes, since birth. Like, I've had high expectations. But yeah, and then this leads into the caregivers that are at home, right? Some other protective factors include the caregivers have higher levels of education. And last time we were talking about some negative risk factors and some negative wellness outcomes. And one of them was like lower education attainment. And so this just kind of goes in the face of that with like the protective factors of caregivers with higher levels of education, those that have graduated from high school and that did not drop out, caregivers with a stable income, which again, you see how these all link together, and caregivers that are able to meet the child's basic needs. Now, that being said, yeah, there are going to be families that struggle and that are caught in the cycle of not even just a cycle of violence, but just a cycle of poverty. And that's not their fault.
No.
Just reminded me of, I don't know where I heard it and I wish I did, but that poverty is violence. It's its own type of violence and its own type of trauma that unfortunately isn't always within the control of the individual. And so
I'd say more often than not, it's not
mostly not
in the individual's control.
Yeah, it's more of an institutional or societal violence on them.
Yeah, it's oppression.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. It's a structure that is unfair. Completely.
Yeah. I'm really glad that you brought that up, because I definitely wanted to make a note of that these families who can't provide to meet basic needs or don't have a stable income, that is not because they don't want to or that they are less than for any reason. There are factors outside their control that have been keeping them in this situation, whatever that might be, with, only part-time work, or we live in public house,
or let's say it's a family that lives in their car and they don't have individual spaces to get homework done or whatever it is. And then that leads into educational attainment, and that leads to unemployment and all of these pieces of poverty that you see. And it's just because, rent went up or higher prices on heating and electricity and groceries. Like, you had to decide between rent and food in your body. Like,
what a terrible decision to have to make too, right?
Yeah.
Do we eat or do we continue to have a roof over our heads?
And can you imagine the conversation that leads to, like, you know what, we could do it. Let's live in our car. Because there are a lot of families living in their cars.
Yeah. It's true.
Let's switch gears just a little bit
please.
And head into community protective factors. So this includes access to health care. This is access to safe housing, like we're talking about. To quality childcare. Do you know how hard it is to find childcare in rural settings?
I think in is a whole, right?
Yes.
Like the cost.
The cost.
Holy
so
moly.
prohibitive for so many families.
It is. Another thing, access to economic assistance programs to nurturing schools, to safe and engaging programs and activities for youth, like after-school programming and even before-school programming, and those teachers who are nurturing and willing to spend the extra time with a student to help tutor them or something, and then education and employment.
Yeah. And I just want, when we talk about access, I want everyone to be on the same page. Access means like these services are available and there are not like significant obstacles or barriers in the way. So, for example, if a family or a person was unable to get transportation to receive some sort of service or fill out an application to get financial help or whatever, that's not the person, like, that's not their fault for not being able to get there, right?
Right.
So yeah, just because resources and services exist doesn't make them accessible within a community. So like when we talk about childcare, well, if you have to work at 5 a.m. and that's the only work that you're qualified for and that you can get, but childcare doesn't open until 6 a.m., then does childcare exist? Yes. Is it accessible to you? No. So just because resources exist also don't necessarily make them accessible.
Yeah.
That's right. And then just imagine that person, right? They would have to find childcare before childcare.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
And often I have to think about childcare after childcare.
Yeah.
Which is just a pain in the neck for myself, and let alone maybe someone who even has additional barriers where they have to like apply for the assistance that they need in order to afford the childcare.
Yeah, and maybe it has to be done on the internet and the person doesn't have like it's just a snowball
It is.
of consequences or outcomes.
Yes. And we also have to think about these community protective factors that are at the community level, like social norms and the culture. And what I mean by this is that we need to have a culture that does not see violence as acceptable. And you had mentioned poverty as a form of violence, right? And so like that would mean poverty is not acceptable. But when we say cultural norms and societal norms, again, we're looking at it from the point of view of like, when I say poverty isn't acceptable, it's not the fault of the people. It's the fault of the system that has created the environment where poverty happens.
Right. And like these societal norms or cultural norms, they're shaping our thoughts and behavior from the moment we are like in utero, essentially.
Yeah.
So, you know, the media we consume, the people we hang out with, the town we live in, all of these things influence the societal and cultural norms. And if collectively we could agree that, you know, an anti-violence cultural norm or that poverty is unacceptable and we're willing to do what it takes to lift people out of those circumstances, those would be cultural norms. But boy, Melissa, it is hard to shift a cultural norm.
So hard.
I mean, we would have done it by now if it was easy.
Correct. The three of us here in this room would have done it if we could have.
Yeah.
No,
I'd be
it's
like,
true.
Violence is over. So
End of story.
Done.
We're just not tolerating it anymore.
racism, done.
Yeah.
No more of that. Sexism,
Over it.
bye.
Later. No, if only we got to just say it and then that's how it was, right? Let's talk a little tiny bit. Sorry about all the as I say it again. Individual protective factors, right? So kiddos or young people that do well in school and have those positive pro-social peers in their life, that in itself is a protective factor. And I realize there are circumstances that could lead to not having pro-social peers, just based on where you live, your neighborhood. Yeah, but we know for sure if we can create a space or an environment where these young people can have the pro-social peers and can thrive at school, they're going to be more resilient when negative things come their way.
And this is something we talk about in prevention education for domestic and sexual violence, right? Like we talk about the skills for a healthy relationship, and often it's modeled by the caregiver. And if a child hasn't seen those behaviors, like they're not going to know how to be in a healthy relationship. And so when we talk about pro-social peers, those are individuals who can reach outside of themselves and help. They share. They can cooperate. They have the ability and motivation to identify and solve a problem. They have skills for empathy. They can take the perspective of another and understand that the person even has a problem. And that's where their empathy can kick in. So these are individuals that have some life skills that maybe someone who hasn't grown up in a space where they had healthy relationships modeled for them. Like if you haven't seen that and you only see it outside of your own family, the question is like, I don't even know how to do that, right? Like you have to see it and practice it in order to have that skill.
Yeah. And I think while I was listening to you talk, I just kept thinking about how this is the beauty of protective factors, is that they can be shared too. So when we're talking about those family protective factors where poverty is coming in and they're placing those barriers to some of those really healthy protective factors, but we go to school in communities where income levels are mixed and family types are mixed. And so your kid can make friends with a peer who has resources and learn to these things, and they can learn from them. And so just because you can't provide necessarily at the family level A, B, and C doesn't mean that your child or an individual doesn't have access to that protective factor. And so, like I was saying before, I just love talking about resiliency and protective factors because there's so much hope there. There's so much just sunshine in talking about and thinking about those protective factors.
Yeah. And, Stephannie, you kind of talked about this a little bit last time, but another community type based protective factor is having positive relationships with adults that aren't your parents, right? Or they don't live in your household.
Yes, absolutely. And especially if you come from a household where your parents never learned those things to be able to teach them to you, and I think it's something that we can all strive to do in our communities, is be that type of person for the youth in our communities, because we can model, we can show conflict resolution, we can walk that path with them and kind of show them how to be a cycle breaker, because cycle breakers don't just wake up one day and go out there and say, no, trauma's done, we're finished, we're done with it. They have a lot of personality traits that like adapt them to that, but they also have people in their lives who care about them, who support them, who teach them how to be that person. And I know for me personally, that's how I got to where I was. Like, there are so many adults in my life who came when I was 16 years old, younger than that even, and they were like, this is what it looks like to sit down at dinner and have a conversation with your kids. This is what it looks like to say thank you to a child for doing something that's helpful to you. And over here, I was like, what? We can thank children because they can be helpful people? And so having those individuals in my life really modeled for me things that I wasn't able to learn in my own household. And so you can make a bigger impact than you even realize just by modeling what it's like to be in a healthy relationship.
Mm-hmm. We tend to call in our space we call them, they're safe adults, right?
Yes, trusted adults, safe adults. Yep.
Yeah. And, I talked with my teenager about this. I'm like, hey, I get you don't want to talk to me about everything. To be fair, I don't necessarily want to talk to you about everything, but my best friend or your aunt, right, like, is actually a great resource. Make sure that he has their number. He has my husband's and my best friend's, both of their numbers, and we talked to our BFFs and said, hey, we're giving him your phone number. We told him if something happens, he can reach out to you if he doesn't want to talk to us, and that you don't have to share that we trust you as an adult to help him manage the situation and still keep, like the privacy that he wants.
I love that. And you model that for your coworkers too, because when you share that story, it inspires me at least to know that like that's something I can do in my own life. That's an applicable kind of thing.
Yeah. Like, I hope Stephannie's kids know, like, right, if there was an emergency, that Heather would happily come scoop them up and do whatever they needed to do.
Absolutely. Or if they had a cat question, they know.
They do know, yes.
It has the answers for the cat questions,
Right.
but it's just building that support network so that you don't feel like you have to shoulder all of that on your own. And it's like, it's so cliche, but it takes a village to raise a child. This is what that village looks like. It provides those protective factors. It brings those resources and makes them accessible where they might not be otherwise.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, as we've been talking about these protective factors, we're talking about building resilience here. And this is a part of skill building that I was just starting to talk about, especially with like the practicing and seeing the healthy relationships modeled around you. It also includes emotional intelligence and social emotional skill building. So identifying those emotions. We talked about earlier how we as parents and caregivers need to start to do our own work and identify our own triggers. And then as we start to have those experiences in identifying our own, we can start to model that for the children in our lives and even walk them through that identifying the emotions and the triggers, and then model your own coping skills too, because first of all, they need to know that you're human.
Yeah.
And that like we have stuff that we deal with, and it's like, okay, whether or not it's a positive or negative coping skill, like hopefully it's a positive one, but like these coping skills should be kind of out there, and like even share. You can even narrate like, hey, I just had to take a step out. I'm back now. I took a few deep breaths. I'm here for you. What's going on? And then you're able to move through their identifying the emotions and then engaging those coping skills, and they're learning from you as you go.
Yeah, that is huge. Sharing your coping skills with telling them what a coping skill is so that they know. And then, yes, sharing your own. I was like smiling over here because as you were talking about sharing them, I always say in my house that my life is a musical and I am the star, because everything I do is like to tune. Like I'm constantly singing it, and that's my coping skill. So my kids know, like if I'm really, really frustrated at them and I don't want to yell at them and I don't want to do something that's gonna hurt them or cause them emotional pain or whatever, I start singing. And so it can be something like, Mommy's really frustrated right now because you're not listening to me. And so it's like, and I will do that all the time. So it's like, if I know that I'm triggered and I know that I can't, I sing it. And so they will do the same thing. Like my middle kid makes up songs all the time because she watches me do it. And she knows like that's a way to get the feelings out there without being rude or mean or yelling. So it is so important.
And a fun way to do it.
It is very fun.
I would come to that show.
Thank you. Thank you. Tickets will be available.
To Stephannie's life musical. So we keep going back to like the parents, right?
Yeah.
And every parent hasn't grown up in these perfect bubbles where they learned healthy relationship skills or they learned conflict resolution. And yeah, that's pretty fair. I think a lot of people in our generation didn't necessarily learn a lot of those great coping skills. So what do? We got to educate the parents, right? And it doesn't have to be us teaching them in a classroom, right? But we got to give them the tools and the knowledge to resolve conflict peacefully and develop their own emotional intelligence, like identifying their triggers and other, sorts of support for parents and just helping parents to heal from their own trauma.
Yeah, and we're all on a journey.
Oh gosh, yeah.
To heal and be supported and get through the things that we've been through as well. And then life is still going on, right? So sometimes we're going to enact some of our stuff on other people. And then we have to deal with the consequences of that and repair and move forward together. And sometimes, like you said, people haven't seen that modeled for them and didn't have it around them. So it's a lifelong journey. And Stephannie, you had mentioned either in a prior episode or in this episode, I'm not really remembering
they
at
all
this point.
mix together.
They do. But just that humility that we have to take on as parents and caregivers, because, you know, Heather, as you were speaking, I was thinking about, in order to accept education as adults, in order to accept other people's tools and resources, we have to get that ego out of the way.
You have to remove it and be able to say, like, even if it's not fair, because sometimes we want to have our own little temper tantrums. Like, I'm not above it where I want to be. That's not fair. But we have to be able to remove that and want to do what's best for ourselves and for our families and accept that kind of guidance and go on our own healing journey.
Yeah. And if you're not having your best day and you're not your best self, like, it's hard to get there, because you're like, no, I do want to throw my own tantrum right now. I want to go down to the level of a toddler and have my own tantrum if I want to, because it's not fair.
Please make room for me on the floor, because we're in this together.
Move your Legos.
Otherwise, I'm going to step on them and kick them. No, but I mean, truly, it's hard when you're not having your best day. And you're not your best self. So that's why, again, self-care is so utterly important as a caregiver. We have to make room for ourselves in our own lives. Otherwise, we're going to make room in not so positive ways in the lives of the people around us.
Absolutely. And when Heather was talking about educating the parents, and that is one of the coolest parts of my job. Like, I love working with my youth because they are just really fun, amazing people. But I also really love getting to work with their parents and getting to model different things for their parents as well. We talk about, like, cutting the trauma off for the child, but sometimes the parents are like, but what about me? Like, how do I do this? And so I get that opportunity to see it from both ends. And, like, one example I have recently, I had to advocate with a parent in an IEP meeting, and they had no idea what they were doing, because that's a very tricky situation and no one really gives you a guidebook for it. And thankfully I did have a guidebook for it. And so I was able to sit in that meeting and show them how to advocate for their child and show them how to ask for what they needed. And now I know that the next time they have to go do that, they have those skills because they were able to see them modeled. And so it is really cool to work with adults and kids on healing some of these traumas and giving them the protective factors and resiliency that they need.
Yeah, the next thing we were going to talk about was actually, like, community programs and activities that can help build resiliency. And Stephannie, the program that you work in does just that. Like, that's exactly what you're doing every single day.
Yes, that is. And whenever I meet a new client, when we do our intake, I say from day one, I am on your team. We are now team whatever. That's our team now. And I'm here to do whatever it is for your family, for you, to help you be successful. What protective factors do you need? And it's different for every client. And I get to be a different person for every client. But it is just something that's so instrumental in our community. And sometimes it makes me sad that, like, I'm so pigeonholed into a very particular area and that, like, these programs don't exist for tons and tons of kids who could use them. Just being able to holistically say, what do you need? Is it transportation? I can do that. Is it food? Let me connect you to the resources. Is it a friend? Let me listen to you. So I just really love that I'm able to do that. And I wish it was something that we had more of overall.
I agree.
Yeah. And truly, you are really describing this piece about connecting caring adults to children. And I know there are a variety of mentorship programs and education programs and after-school programs and things like that. But you're right. Not everyone gets the access to programs like the one that you are providing, which is really neat that you're able to say, you know, what do you need? I'll connect you. Or what do you need? I'll be there.
Yeah. I mean, and that always, like, that's like the Big Brothers, Big Sisters, right? Or adopted grandparent programs, things like that. I just think that those are so meaningful and so beneficial, not just to, like, the kiddo and the adult, but to the whole community, to the family, to the school system. Like, It impacts everything.
Right.
So another thing we can do to support communities is just provide the economic supports that they need. Now, this is difficult, and both in our positions, mine and Melissa's and Stephannie's, we do have to navigate the systems in trying to get the financial resources or economic resources to clients. It's not always easy, but there are programs, right? Like LIHEAP is a program to help you pay your utility bills. Head Start is essentially childcare. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a lot of these programs around, but they are generally underfunded, understaffed. We really, as a community, as a society, need to put more resources into these economic supports for families.
Absolutely.
And I think, too, it's like if we could get these economic supports to these families, some of these families that like we're looking at family protective factors, all they need is the economic resources. Like it's not that they don't have what it takes to be the parents that they need to be, or like they don't have this, it's that they don't have the economic support. And if they can get access to that, that's going to revolutionize the way that they're able to raise their children.
Yeah, it does. And we've seen it, especially through COVID, because there were a lot of additional funding opportunities for kids and families. I remember they couldn't get kicked out of housing anymore, right? So everybody had stable housing, just period. There was no risk. It was illegal. They increased the food stamp allowances and stopped making people jump through 30 different hoops to get them.
Kids got free lunch from their home schools.
And we saw child hunger drop because of it.
Yeah, those are just incredible outcomes of finding ways to support economically the people in our society, and especially those at the margins of the margins, right? My favorite.
I mean, every time you say it, it makes me smile.
So, and this is really getting at the societal norms, right? Like these things that we just accept as everyday, like these are the messages that we take in. And this is part of our resilience building, is changing those social norms, really taking on anti-violence as a social norm. Like this is what's acceptable to us. Like we do not accept violence. We do not tolerate domestic and sexual violence. We don't tolerate people being okay with people going hungry,
right?
Those kinds of things. Another social norm that we would love to see changed, and that would help build resilience, is parenting that moves away from more traditional authoritarian parenting styles. Because as we've been talking about, like in order to do what we're talking about, you got to do your own work. You have to get your ego out of the way, and that means you really need to be providing yourself some space, because otherwise you don't even have time to notice your ego if you haven't developed that space for yourself to be you and know even who you are. And then another social norm that we want to lift up as a resilience builder is communities that feel connected to each other. And I want to add that in building resilience, there's also a school of thought about building resistance, and resistance is part of resilience. And Robinson and Schmitz put out this amazing paper called Beyond Resilience, Resistance in the Lives of LGBTQ Youth. And what this is talking about truly, and earlier Heather mentioned strengths-based prevention that we do. And we have really tried to be better at not looking so much with an at-risk lens when we say like, oh, well, they're at higher risk for victimization. And I still do use that language every now and then. But this is a really, really good reminder here. Like rather than looking at people with they have a deficit, we can look with a more nuanced strengths-based lens and really shift to understanding their resistance and their joy and their pleasure. And that they can have a counter narrative about themselves, that they don't have to have this like, oh, there's something wrong with me. I'm a higher risk population. Like so something's inherently wrong with me. Like, rather, we could do some asset mapping. We could look at what the strengths are in that person's life. Like, what protective factors do they have? What could we put in place? And let's map that out and build a different narrative for them. And they can embody who they are. And that in itself, like embodying who you are, is an act of resistance.
Oh, heck yeah. Yeah.
And focusing on joy and pleasure and things like that.
Yeah, I'm not letting you all bring me down, right? Like,
Yeah.
I'm going to be happy and joyful in myself, and you can just kiss my butt if you don't like it.
Exactly.
And knowing that your worth isn't dependent on having or not having, that you have inherent worth and that you deserve to feel joy regardless of whether or not you live in your car or whether or not you have a pro-social like you deserve. Your worth isn't based on these things, and that there are things in place, and that all of us have at least a protective factor that we can cling to and that we can hold on to and let that carry us. So
Yeah, well said. So I think in closing, traumatic events are unavoidable, right? We're not going to get through our life, as much as I wish we could, without trauma, stress, and adverse experiences. But we can reduce the impact of the trauma or the adverse experience by building resistance and protective measures and things of that nature.
So truly, it's important to start thinking about building those protective and resilience factors and our resistance factors from day one.
Yeah, once the baby's been conceived, right?
Yes. Yes, we're going to
Let's
focus on
start.
pleasure.
But
Yes.
like, seriously, you know,
Sorry. Now you're going to get weird romance, Melissa.
I don't think it's weird, but I think
Thank you.
we need to support the person carrying the baby, right?
Yes.
And
Yes, please.
access to health care and nutrition and
after baby.
well, of
check
course.
in.
support.
Yeah.
Yes,
Check
mental
in.
health support, all of those
Yes.
things. Yeah.
But yeah, those protective factors start in utero when the birthing parent is carrying the child, right?
Yes.
It's not, truly, it's before then, right? It's even before a baby is conceived, honestly. It's getting to know ourselves and being able to lean on our strengths and ask for help and all that good stuff.
Yes. Yes. So we want to share the media we love. This week, it's Queer America Podcast. This takes listeners on a journey that spans from Harlem to the frontier West, revealing stories of LGBTQ life we should have learned in school. So this is a podcast from Learning for Justice, and you can find this podcast, Queer America, at learningforjustice.org.
Yeah, and we wanted to highlight this one because young folks who are queer and in the school system, if they're hearing about role models and scientists and historians and that are queer, right? This builds their self-worth because we have left that out of the discussion for so long. So connecting them to even historical figures that were queer, like we'll say Emily Dickinson, right? How many people actually knew that some of her poetry was about women? You know, it helps queer young people to see and value themselves in a new way.
Yeah, I mean, representation matters, right? So.
It absolutely matters.
Yeah.
And I should just say about Learning for Justice, this was developed with the University of Wisconsin Press, and they're actually the publishers of the first curriculum for high school and university students that were learning about history and queer history. So yeah, they were sort of the first people on the scene to do this.
Yes. So we thank you again for listening. This has been this is the final episode in our trauma mini-series, and we thank you, Stephannie, so much for being here. You have been such a gift to this conversation, and we just adore you.
Well, once again, thank you for letting me spend time with you and have these conversations. I had so much fun, and I'm grateful for the experience.
Thank you, Stephannie. Thank you, Melissa. And thank you to our super podcast guru, Alex.
Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Keep an eye out for new podcasts that drop every other Monday, and you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, or anywhere else you might be listening to podcasts. We'd love to hear from you, so you can give us a shout at our email, saferjourneyspod@safejourneysillinois.com. You can also message us on Facebook or Instagram at our Safer Journeys podcast pages. If you need to reach out for domestic or sexual violence, our Safe Journeys hotline supports people in Livingston and LaSalle County, located in North Central Illinois. And our support line number is 815-673-1555. For those of you out of our listening area, if you've experienced sexual violence and need to reach out to a support line, you can call RAIN with 2 N's at 1-800-656-HOPE. You can also reach out on their website and chat live. You may call the domestic violence hotline if you've experienced or are experiencing domestic violence. It is simply called The Hotline. You can find them at thehotline.org, where you can live chat on their website, or you can give them a call at 1-800-799-SAFE.